It's another Tricky Thursday here for you. My name is Trisha. I'm the owner of Creative Costume Academy. It is my mission to help you learn the easy, basic pattern making principles so you can start using them immediately and start making things that you dream of. Today I want to talk about seam allowance. Seam allowance is so important in sewing, and I talk about it a lot in pattern making. And as a pattern maker, you really get to decide what you choose as the seam allowance. It comes in really handy, especially when we're talking about making a mock-up or making things to be adjustable, which I'll be talking more about this month as well. So generally with a commercial pattern, a lot of times you will see the standard 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which means that you get your needle 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, and that means it's 5/8 seam allowance. Some patterns, I think Mood has patterns that are written for 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I use that a lot myself on a lot of my finished patterns. And then a lot of times you will hear me say when I do a mock-up or something that I'm not sure of, I will add extra seam allowance like 1 inch or even 1.5 inches sometimes. We learn that in theater so that we can make adjustments, we can use that seam allowance as needed. Now, the stitching line is the true shape of what that pattern will be. It allows it to fit the body how it's supposed to fit or how the pattern is drafted to fit. So anything you add beyond that line, beyond your stitching line, is your seam allowance. So wherever you're supposed to stitch your line, that amount, if it's 5/8, if it's 1/2 inch, or if it's 1 inch, that's your seam allowance. So when I'm talking about if you are going to add seam allowance to your pattern or you're going to take seam allowance off of, I'm talking about that space that goes from your stitching line to the edge of your fabric. So if you have 1 inch seam allowance added to your pattern, that means that you need to stitch it, your stitching line, your needle needs to sit 1 inch away from the edge of your fabric. So if you stitch it 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of your fabric, then basically you're adding to the pattern as it was drafted. So you're utilizing that seam allowance, but you're making the garment bigger by doing that because it allowed for 1 inch seam allowance. I'm going to take you over to the table and kind of show you some visuals so that hopefully it will help you to understand. I know it's a little confusing just hearing me talk about it, but adding extra seam allowance or determining the amount of seam allowance that you have on your pattern will really help you when you're sewing things. It'll help you with fit, and it'll also help you. The reason we have that extra seam allowance that we want when we're doing a mock-up or even when you're making a finished garment in some cases, so that you have that extra play. You're going to stitch it at 1 inch, but maybe when you try it on, or if you're using it for a different person than the original pattern was intended to be, and it is a little bit tight, it's a little small, you have that 1 inch that you can even go down to as small as, if you sewed it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're adding as much as 1.5 inches into that seam if you originally started with 1 inch seam allowance. Now, if this is not making sense, let me show you a visual and maybe that'll further explain. Let's take a look at this pattern that I drafted recently. On my patterns, draw in my seam allowance so I can clearly see what it is. I have a 1/2 inch here at this side back seam. I did still leave 1 inch even in my final pattern on the side seams. I have a 1/2 inch up here at the neck, and I have a 1/2 inch connecting to the yoke as well as the sleeve and the neck. That's just what I chose as the pattern maker for this pattern, and then center back is on a fold, so there is no seam allowance there. If you're working with a commercial pattern and you don't see the stitching lines, you don't see where that seam allowance is, you can easily draw that in, and it's usually indicated on the pattern somewhere how much seam allowance is included in the pattern. And if you are making any kind of sizing adjustments or you want to make any seam allowance adjustments, I suggest that you draw that in if it's not already. But let's talk about this. So this has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If I were to say this is cut out of fabric, what I want to do when I put it under my sewing machine, I want to make sure that the needle is going to be hitting on this 1/2 inch line. So when I put it at my sewing machine, my needle needs to be here and the edge of my fabric needs to be hitting that 1/2 inch line on your presser foot plate. If you were to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, not paying attention to the 1/2 inch seam allowance, your stitching line is going to end up being here, and what it is, you're going to end up making this whole back piece, or at least this seam, you're going to be making it 1/4 of an inch smaller because you are going inside 1/8 of an inch for both the side back and the center back. And then if you did the same thing on the other side, you could make your whole back of the shirt 1/2 inch smaller than it was planned to be. And then because this pattern connects to it, it's going to then make this yoke be too big when you go to sew it onto the yoke piece. So having your right seam allowance is really important. Now going the other way, if you for whatever reason sewed it at 3/8 and had your needle at 3/8 and the edge of your fabric at 3/8 or even 1/4 of an inch, then you're going to be adding space than what the original pattern was intended to be. So that's why you really, whatever your seam allowance is, you want to know what your seam allowance is if you didn't create the pattern yourself, so that you're not adding or taking away as you're sewing up your garment. Now the reason I leave 1 inch seam allowance on the side seam is so that I have future adjustment possibilities and making it easy for myself. I do this also for mock-ups. So if I have 1 inch seam allowance, you can still see that my stitching line is 1 inch away from the edge of my paper, meaning when I sew this up under the machine, I want the edge of my fabric to be hitting the 1 inch line on my presser foot plate, and my needle should be on the stitching line. If I were to sew this up at 5/8, I would be adding, right around here would be 5/8 going all the way down. You can see that I would be adding in extra space for both my front and my back at the side seam, and then my sleeve might not fit into this arm's eye because I made it that much bigger. This helps us when we're doing a mock-up, because if I've sewn a mock-up and I've stitched it with a basting stitch at my 1 inch mark, but say it's a little bit snug in the waist and I want to let it out, I can go ahead and open that seam and pin it at a smaller seam allowance. And if I sewed it at a smaller seam allowance, the stitching line is then moved. So maybe I want to give myself a little bit of extra space right there in the waist, but maybe the hips and the bust were still already good utilizing that 1 inch seam allowance. So when I go to make the actual garment, if I don't want to add back in seam allowance so that I have 1 inch again, I just need to know that this new stitching line or new pinning line that I pinned on myself is now my new stitch line. So this line is going away, and I actually have less seam allowance now here, but I start with 1 inch up here and 1 inch down at my hem because I didn't change it there. So as a pattern maker, I always recommend that either you cut this all even. So if this ended up being 1/2 inch seam allowance down here, I would suggest you cut it 1/2 inch all the way down and up so that it's easy. You're going to have your edge of your fabric 1/2 inch away from the needle going all the way down, or you add extra to this so that you have a 1 inch seam allowance going all the way down if that's what you wanted to have in your finished garment. So whatever seam allowance you have included on your pattern, that's what you want to sew it up as, so that you're getting a true representation of what that pattern is drafted to be. But the reason for adding extra seam allowance is so in case you want to give yourself, if you intentionally want to make it bigger, then you have that extra space, you have that extra fabric to go into. If this was only 1/2 inch seam allowance and I wanted to make it bigger, like over here, I could only make it bigger up to maybe 3/8 of an inch. I could maybe, make it bigger over here and come out a little bit on that side, my stitching line, and then your seam allowance gets really small, which gets tricky to sew. And if I'm fitting something for the first time, I'd rather give myself more space to go into in case I need it for fitting purposes. So I hope this makes sense. And please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'm happy to help clarify. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.